This is the Listening Books Podcast, for every kind of reader and especially for fans of audiobooks. I'm Jessica Stone, and today I'm talking with Florence Wilkinson, author of Wild City: Encounters with Urban Wildlife. Narrated by Shazia Nichols, this audiobook has been one of the top nonfiction books in our collection since we added it last year, and it tells us about the rewards of paying closer attention to the species on our doorstep. Florence, I have really been enjoying listening to the audiobook of Wild City. I wonder, can you start off by just telling me a little about how this book came to be and what you wanted for it?
Yeah, so a few years ago, I co-founded a birdsong recognition app called Warbler. And you essentially hold up your phone, record a bird, and Warbler will tell you what species of bird you're listening to. And through the experience of working on this app, I had all these people get in touch with me saying, I started hearing birds everywhere on my commute into work or, at the train station or in my back garden. And it was really interesting because the birds had always been there, but now that people had an app to record and identify them, they were suddenly listening out for them. And I began to realize that a lot of people who live in an urban environment don't really recognize that there is wildlife all around them. And, if we don't recognize that it's there, we're not going to care about it. And if we don't care about it, we're not going to protect it. And I began thinking about how, a lot of people travel really far to go and see wildlife. They might go to what they think of as the countryside in this country, or they might go overseas. They might go to the Serengeti. They might think that wildlife lives in the Amazon rainforest. But, conservation begins on our doorstep. So I had this desire to get people to recognize and appreciate what was around them. And of course, we're all conscious now that we should be flying less and that kind of thing as well. And so I wanted to, shine a light on that wildlife that is on people's doorsteps. And actually, 8 in 10 of us in the UK live in an urban environment. So this is most of us as well. And at the same time, we kind of have this idea of countryside, and often what we think of as countryside is farmland. And actually, a lot of our countryside has become increasingly inhospitable to wildlife. We've got these big fields and monoculture and use of pesticides and huge machinery and removal of hedgerows. And, some of this farmland is actually pretty much a biodiversity desert. There's nothing there. Whereas in urban environments, you've got this really interesting patchwork of small habitats in which, some of them are pretty inhospitable to wildlife as well. If you're talking about sort of concrete and impermeable surfaces, etc. Although, as you'll find in my book, you can find wildlife even in these places. But actually, some parts of our urban areas are actually really quite great patches of habitat for wildlife, and you can find more there than you can find in a lot of what people consider to be the countryside.
Yeah, I think that was one of the big surprises for me listening to the book was there was a statement given that you're actually more likely to encounter wildlife in an urban environment than a rural environment, which was astounding. But actually the reasons for that given really made sense. Because as you were just saying about how much of a rural environment might be an undiversified territory. But also, I think you said that wildlife are kind of more habituated to human presence as well in urban areas. So they're not as likely to hide from you, I guess.
Exactly that. So I grew up, I was born in London, but I grew up in North Essex, which is semi-rural, relatively rural, I would say. And when I was growing up, I had never seen a red fox up close, for example. I'd never seen a kingfisher in the wild. I'd never seen a cormorant up close. And then moving to London, um, you know, there I see foxes pretty much every night running right past me, really, really close encounters because they're used to people. And like you say, they're habituated. And equally, I saw there's a cormorant well, there's a number of cormorants near me on the canal, and I watched them kind of standing there and drying their wings or diving and then popping up a few meters further down the canal. And same with kingfishers. I've seen kingfishers on the
Wow.
canal in London and hadn't seen them elsewhere in the UK at all. So, you can have these experiences in urban environments.
The audiobook is mostly read by Shazia Nichols, but you read the foreword and then the final manifesto yourself. Was that important to you to read those yourself?
Yeah, it was. I'm not, I wanted someone who was a professional to read the book. Uh, I thought that was probably better. And I think it's really important to make audiobooks as engaging as possible. And I think, some people have certain strengths and others don't. And so I wanted someone who was going to have a really engaging voice and engaging way of reading to do the bulk of it. But equally, I guess the preface and then in particular the manifesto and the acknowledgements at the end were really important and quite personal. So I thought it would be nice if I could read those bits and then hand the rest over to someone who's used to doing this.
Yeah. Um, and did you have much to do with the selection of who read the main parts of it?
Yeah, so my publisher was really great actually and involved me in everything. So, for example, often you don't have much say in the cover or the illustrations of your book, whereas I had a huge amount of input and I really appreciated that. And the same with the artist reading the book. So I was given a few people to choose from and asked for what my opinion was. So yeah, I was involved in that process, which was really interesting, really nice. It was a new process to me as well. I mean, as well as writing, do a lot of filmmaking. So I'm used to being on the other side and interviewing people and filming people. And so it's quite interesting to kind of flip that round a little bit.
Yeah.
But yeah, I'm really pleased with the job that she did. I think she did really well.
I think so too. It was really enjoyable to listen to, but I also enjoyed that personalized touch of having the beginning and the very end read by you. That was nice to hear your actual voice coming through for those very personal parts. Throughout Wild City, I noticed a common theme, which was that our perception of human made environments is very different from how wildlife might experience it. And I wonder if you might share maybe a favorite example of this.
Yeah, there's quite a lot of examples, but I'll try and pick a favorite. Um, you know, I just to touch on a few, I really like this idea, for example, of because people put up this strange sort of imagined boundary between city and countryside as if wildlife kind of reaches this no-go zone and it's like, oh wait, I don't belong here. I'm going to turn back and back to the countryside. So if you're a peregrine falcon, you're not going to look up at a tower block and think, oh, well, that's a tower block and humans built that for humans to live in. So it's not for me. I'm going to head back to the cliffs. You're going to go, oh, there's a nice big cliff. Let me check if there's a decent ledge on there that I can build my nest on. And there's plenty of pigeons, which also like this cliff that I can eat. So, but during the lockdown, I went on one of my daily walks and I walked all the way to Trafalgar Square. And in the fountain there, I found a female mallard and a whole host of ducklings. And I'd seen ducks in the fountain before because, again, if you're a duck flying over, well, there's a water body, I'll stop there, but not a whole family like that. And all I can imagine is that because it was quieter at the time as well, there weren't many people around. She must have thought, oh, I'll build my nest here. And there was no way that the ducklings could have got into the fountain. It was too steep. And actually, it was a problem because they couldn't get out of it. And obviously, that water is slightly chlorinated. So I think she must have built her nest there. And yeah, obviously, there was a bit of an issue. So I took a load of photos, of course, and then immediately alerted a wildlife protection organisation who actually turned up and managed to retrieve them all and take them to a more suitable
Oh,
habitat.
good. I'm so glad that had a happy ending.
Oh, yes.
I feel, as you were describing that, I was thinking that ought to be a children's book, the story of that duck and those ducklings. Wouldn't that be a lovely story?
Mm,
Um,
mm.
you mentioned COVID and lockdown, which makes a number of appearances throughout the book. And it seems like the shutdown of so much human activity offered some unique opportunities for us. Can you maybe share a little of what we learned from that unique time?
Yeah, so obviously I was writing the book throughout the pandemic, and we were all confined to our homes at that point. There was that period where we could only go out for 1 hour a day. And one of the interesting things I think is, I don't know how familiar you are with the idea of a patch, but birders in particular, so people who like watching birds, often have a patch that they go to regularly, maybe every day, and record what they see there. And this is something that naturalists often do as well. They have their own patch and they observe in close quarters the changes over
Mm.
time. And I think we all became a bit like that. We became more aware of our immediate surroundings because we were confined necessarily to our patch. And of course, the first lockdown was during that really beautiful spring as well, when the weather was absolutely amazing. And I know that I definitely took solace in the signs of spring more than I ever had before. And I was watching the buff-tailed bumblebees. I had a nest at the back of the garden. I became really obsessed with my garden birds and feeding them. And I learned kind of what they preferred in terms of food. And I was there busy attending to them. I think they must think I'm very lax now because, yeah, I spent so much time with them during the lockdown. And I think and I hope that we all realised as well, because I'm really fortunate to have a small garden, but a lot of people don't living in the city. And I think we all hopefully realise how important our public green spaces are. And I just hope that that's something that people cling on to. Because I guess the other thing is as well, we could hear more because there weren't the planes going over, there wasn't the roar of traffic. So again, it was a little bit like that experience that I had with Warbler, where people were saying, "Oh, I'm hearing the birds singing. You know, do you think that they're changing and evolving?" Well, you know, if you think of how long the lockdowns lasted, within evolutionary terms, it won't even register. But I think there is probably a good chance that the birds could hear each other better, as well as us being able to tune in and hear them better. So perhaps they were singing more vociferously because they could hear, you know, the robin could hear the nearest robin really clearly. So it was like, I better stand up and protect my territory here. So, so I think sound played a big part in all of this as well.
That's so interesting. You mentioned birds and the sort of evolutionary process. There, you alluded to the possibility in the book that actually, was it blackbirds, that blackbirds might be evolving separately in urban environments than rural environments. Was there any more you'd like to say about that? I think it was just a sort of parenthetical in the book, but my ears perked up and I thought, ooh, that's interesting.
So there's a book that I read when I was researching Wild City called Darwin Comes to Town, and it contains loads of amazing research and stories about how wildlife is evolving within an urban setting. And that could be, there are different ways in which that could be taking place. So a lot of the creatures that do well in cities have what we call behavioral plasticity. So they tend to be curious, they tend to be able to learn and change their behavior. Now, that's not evolution, but that is species reacting to their environments. But there are also fascinating examples of how species are actually potentially evolving based on an urban environment, which does make sense actually, because when you think about evolution, it is species reacting to their environment. It's just that I think in the past perhaps we didn't think it could happen quite so quickly. So blackbirds are one example, but there are quite a few examples as well. I think is it great tits? There was a study that suggested that urban great tits were evolving to have a different length of beak to help them getting into bird
Hmm.
feeders. So it's really, really interesting. And I actually touched upon the finches in the Galapagos in my book as well. So the finches, which are quite famous because they helped Darwin to uncover uh, evolution to write the origin of species. But it seems that the finches, the interesting thing is their beaks and how their beaks change and adapt to the environments. And again, they seem to be adapting to the more urban parts of Galapagos where they're eating crisps and pizza. So, yeah, I mean, I don't know if Darwin would have expected that one, but it's very interesting.
Crisps and pizza, irresistible to not just our own species.
Exactly.
Another thing that I was struck by listening to the book was the tension that was often there between our human desire for order, a sort of imposed order, and how fundamentally wildness kind of challenges that. So, for example, I loved the phrase "spontaneous plants" in place of weeds. I wonder, is there an example of something we can refrain from doing, relaxing our standards for orderliness, that would help our wildlife?
Yeah, absolutely. And this is a really big thing in urban environments. In fact, like a huge amount of the green spaces in our urban environments are made up by people's gardens. So there are some things that we can refrain from doing, and some things that we can actively do as well. AstroTurf or any kind of artificial grass. Do not put that in your garden. That stuff is horrendous. It kills anything underneath it because of the chemicals and then the plastic and the soil compaction. So it kills anything under it. And then obviously birds can't get to worms within the soil. It has a hugely negative impact. So no to astroturfing. Ideally not too much paving, not too much decking. And then if you've got a lawn, for example, don't feel the need to mow it all the time or leave borders around it with longer parts. And, I know that people are tempted to keep a perfect lawn, but actually a dandelion is a great thing and clover is a great thing. And they provide food for pollinators. And then when they seed, they provide food for birds. So people think of them as weeds, but actually, do you know, it's really interesting. Sorry, this is a bit of a tangent, but thinking of dandelions, I saw a really lovely thread, I think, on Twitter or on social media somewhere. And it was someone in Singapore had found a photo of dandelions and was asking where they could get this beautiful plant from for their own gardens.
Oh,
And
oh,
yeah,
wow.
and it just sort of turns that whole notion on its head. And actually, the definition of a weed is a plant out of place. And, it's not out of place if unless you decide it's out of place. So now when I look at my own garden, I mean, I'm always intrigued when things pop up and I'm like, well, that wasn't that there before. Where's that come from? And I always leave it to grow because I want to see what it is. And that actually, having that kind of attitude, and also I think we could really urge the people who look after our public spaces, like our local councils, to take this attitude a bit as well. Obviously, pavements, for example, need to be safe for people with disabilities. You don't want people to slip, etc. But we don't need to poison or strim everything out of existence. And I think we should get used to seeing things pop up and thinking, you know what, this isn't messy. This is this is nature and this is important. And another thing about the lockdown was that actually, for once, there was a period where people weren't going out and trimming and mowing and cutting everything down. And I found on my walks, and I think a lot of others did as well, there's a lot of incidental plants, if you will, that will pop up. And they never get the chance to flower. So people think, oh, there's a weed. But actually, if you don't cut them down at that period at which they often assiduously mow everything down or spray weed killer, and if you leave them until spring, they'll actually pop up with a load of flowers
Mm,
and you'll see that there's something rather lovely.
yeah. I particularly love the example of the dandelions. I guess because for a long time now they've seemed a sort of a philosophical kind of object lesson. I don't know. I remember having this conversation with my partner years ago that I just didn't understand why this free gift, like why we're not more grateful for something that we put no effort into, that just arrived without our labor and without our planning, that just appeared and is this bright, cheerful flower, and why we felt like because we hadn't intended it, it must be rooted out. It to me, it's such
Mm.
an emblem of the switch in perception that might be helpful as we're trying to preserve wildlife.
No, I completely agree with you. And I think actually we condition our children when we're bringing them up. So I've got a 9 month old now. The book came out just before the baby came out. And I've noticed, from when he was really, really small, the one thing he would do is gaze up at trees or any kind of greenery. He just loved to look at it. And children love dandelions. They love blowing the seeds away. They love the flowers. They love daisies. And I think in telling them, this isn't important, this isn't magical, this isn't special, this is very ordinary, and we trim it and we get rid of it, we take that away. And we do the same with some wildlife as well. So my book is very much about opening people's eyes up to the things that they wouldn't expect to find in cities. But it's also about getting people to understand that the things that they do expect are interesting and worthy of our attention as well.
Yeah. Um, Speaking of sort of fostering that curiosity and recalling that you sort of were pulled into this with an app called Warbler and hearing birdsong, I wonder for those of us who, well, I'll just say that when I go outside for a walk, it is very difficult for me not to immediately be lost in my own thoughts and not observant of what's around me. I really have to continually pull my focus back to what's around me. I'm just wondering if you maybe have any advice for people like me who are new to being interested in the natural world around us, how we might direct our focus.
I think that's a really good question. Firstly, I wouldn't be too tough on yourself about that, because I think everyone is that way. And actually, I'm particularly bad. I am always on my phone. I very much sort of live in the modern world, and I can be pretty terrible at being absorbed by all of these distractions and not able to do one thing at once. And, if I'm watching TV, for example, I'm sending an email at the same time. I think it is a conscious thing. And I think what you're doing is completely right. I think that you do almost need to have a word with yourself and say, let's just experience this for a minute. Because I'm also really bad at trying to take photos of everything. I love taking photos. I love filming things. But actually, sometimes you need to stop and just take it in for yourself. But I have always found that although my attention wanders a lot, watching wildlife is something that really will engross me. So when I was growing up, we had a big pond in our back garden, and I could sit and watch the pond for a very long time because there was so much going on in it. So maybe it also helps to pick something that's almost like a little self-contained world or a microcosm. Some people are only really interested in big things, but I've always been interested in small things and small happenings as well. But maybe looking into a body of water, for example, is a good place to start because there's a lot that's happening. And actually, potentially a lot if you're in your local park, for example, perhaps there's a lot that's happening at different levels as well. So within, you've got the water birds, but also a lot going on within the water as well.
That's really great. Thank you. I appreciate the permission not to be too hard on ourselves as well. I did find the other day when I was taking a walk and just trying to find tricks to direct my focus. Actually, a friend of mine used to, on Facebook, she would occasionally post these charts that it would be maybe about the population, and it would be something kind of random, but she was a mathematics teacher, and so she wanted her students to have a look at these, and the two questions she asked them was, what do you notice and what do you wonder? And I find myself going back to those two questions all the time. And I do find them kind of helpful in directing my attention when I'm going for a walk. If I'm struggling, especially, I just start with, okay, what do I notice? And it can be very basic. Okay, I notice these leaves, and I wonder what they are because I don't know. I recognize the stuff around them, but I don't know what those are. And it can be, and then with apps that we have available now that can help us identify things, you can sort of follow that curiosity a bit further and then wonder, well, why is it there?
I think that's a brilliant tip. There's an app that I really love called Picture This,
Yeah.
and you can take, because I'm terrible with plants. In fact, I'm not an expert at all. This is just something that I love, and I love talking to people that are experts and asking them lots of questions because I wonder about a whole host of things all the time. But yeah, Picture This is a really brilliant app because you can take photo of any plant and then it will come up with what the plant is, and for the most part it seems to be very accurate. They'll give you pictures so you can obviously compare it with what you're looking at, and I really really love it. And you can end up in a real wormhole as well, because once you find out what the plant is, you start searching and then you find out what it might have been used for medicinally in the past and whether you could eat it and all this kind of thing. And yeah, I think that's really really great. And I think probably having had a baby as well helps in that obviously he's a huge focus of my attention, but babies and children very much live in the moment, and so I think that can help too. I quite often try to follow what he's looking at and wonder why he's looking at it and what's kind of caught his attention and what's fascinating him, because it's often something that I wouldn't have given a second glance, and yet it's somehow captivating his attention because for him everything is new. And I hope as he gets older as well, we can go out and look at things together, and hopefully he will ask me lots of questions, and if I don't know the answer we can go and look it up together, which I think is a really important thing as well.
Wild City details some of the challenges wildlife face because of human development. But you also talk about and with those who are doing their best to help and to change things. And I just wonder, like, what's giving you hope right now? Where are you seeing significant promise?
So I love people as well as wildlife. And I say that because I think there is maybe a small subsection of people who love wildlife who don't love people, and
Mm.
who also don't want to share wildlife and they want to keep it for themselves, as it were, and keep it in a bubble. And I'm very much not like that. But people give me hope as well as sometimes giving me despair. And Wild City is very much about people as well as wildlife. I think for too long we have divorced the two, and also quite frankly not recognized that we are we are part of this as well, and we are in some ways wild creatures ourselves. So we are mammals. Just because we have taken over this planet doesn't mean that we're not part of it. And I think, while I love nature documentaries as much as anyone else, the fact that we film just the wildlife, and then the minute that sorry, this is a bit of a tangent again, but I heard a really interesting story recently about one of the big wildlife production companies that makes a lot of those documentaries, and someone saying, "Oh, we're getting this amazing shot of these gorillas, but then a load of villagers came, and so we had to stop filming." It's like, why didn't you carry on filming? But this idea that, the shot would be ruined if there were people walking straight past the gorillas. I mean, I think that would be an amazing shot personally. But anyhow, it's not a good idea to divorce the two, but there are some amazing human beings who are doing so much for wildlife, just a few of whom I was lucky enough to meet and interview for my book, and who were so generous with their time and showing me what they were doing and what was on their doorstep. You've got people abseiling off cliffs to ring peregrine and raven chicks. You've got people taking it on themselves to look after areas of land and stop people from mowing and plant up their local tree pit, which is something pretty much anyone can do with native species. And so there's a huge amount of amazing things that are going on. And the only thing I would say is that a lot of these people are ecologists who do this as their day job, and then they spend all their spare time doing it as well. So while they give me hope, I do think that we all need to pile pressure on the authorities, like local and the government as well, to take more action, because we can't just leave it all down to these individuals. It's too much to expect.
You end the book with a manifesto which gives lots of suggestions that people can take to help. For those of us who are starting at zero, what's something small that we can do?
So, if you have a garden, you can do nothing, or at least do a lot less. So if you've got a lawn, you can mow it less. You can ditch the weed killer. You can order ladybirds on the internet and get them delivered, and they will do a very good job of controlling any aphids for you. So
Oh, nice.
And there are plenty of things. There are plenty of things that you can do as well to ditch the weed killer. So that would be one big thing if you've got a garden, and to just leave little messy areas, things like wood piles and dead hedges and compost heaps, that sort of thing. But also, yeah, just being a bit of a lazier gardener, really. That's definitely a small and easy step. And certainly, I know I've said it before, but no fake grass, please. But then, if you don't have a garden, there's a lot you can do too. So I was talking about, I really love these people who describe themselves as guerrilla gardeners, and they go out and they plant things in their local tree pits. You can also just raise awareness to make other people aware that our cities are alive, that there is wildlife, there is nature in our cities. And another one I'm really passionate about is creating blue spaces. So we talk a lot about green spaces, but we have lost huge numbers of our ponds and water bodies in this country. So again, if you have a garden, you can create a pond, and that can be tiny. I've got a half wine barrel in my tiny garden, but just creating an area of water, even if it's not big enough for an amphibian to breed in, it will be big enough for insects to breed in, and that has a huge impact. It'll be a place that bees can stop and drink and birds can stop and drink. So that's a big thing. But maybe you could get together and persuade your local primary school to create a pond if you don't have a space of your own. This is a much bigger one, but if you're thinking about building work, there's some things that you can do as well. So if you're thinking of having a loft extension, you can install swift bricks at the same time. So creating a home for swifts, for example. You can, if you live in an area where there are hedgehogs, you can create hedgehog highways in your fences. And then there's the opportunity to plant on different planes as well. So we've recently had a small one-story extension built, but we've put a green roof on top with wildflowers that will bloom from March through to October. And that's
Mm.
over where our patio used to be. So my idea was that I wanted to create new space and better value space for biodiversity rather than losing it in our as part of our building work. So there's a lot that we can do, and yeah, very much campaigning for nature as well.
I love that you mentioned the Swift bricks, because that was one of the stories sort of early on that I found quite moving, because the way you described how they would come back to where they used to have a nest and just circle and circle and circle, trying to find, because they always go back to the same place. And if somebody's just done an extension and not done something like this, put a Swift brick in there, that they're just kind of bereft. And I don't know, I found that a really touching story. And I was so glad to hear that there are solutions to this. You don't have to just not do your building works, that you can actually incorporate solutions that will still help the Swifts when they return.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I love swifts. They're such incredible birds. And I think one of the things that I love about them is that they spend so much of their life on the wing. When they're born and they first fledge, the juveniles can spend years on the wing, never landing. I mean, imagine that. They
Wow.
sleep while they're in the air. So they're these kind of ethereal creatures. And yet, when they come to the most important part of their lives each year, which is to create a nest and fledge young, they choose the most urban of environment in which to do it, and they have completely evolved alongside us. So they exclusively nest in buildings, and yeah, I just find you see the swifts overhead in central London, and you hear them screeching, and you see them kind of popping into their nests within the rafters of buildings. And it really is truly incredible that this bird is, I guess, a bird of two halves in such a dramatic way.
Yeah. You were saying before about how you're not sort of championing wildlife at the expense of people, that people are very much part of the equation as well. And yet sometimes it does seem like there's a conflict between what's in humans' interest and what's in their neighboring species' interest. And that comes through a few times in the book. Um, so I guess what I'm wondering is, what is the human case for doing what we can to preserve and encourage wildlife?
Yeah, do you know, it's really hard. Just to give an example on my own back doorstep, in Camden, where I live, um, they have long been and will continue to be building for a long time, HS2. And as a result, they have routed through where there's quite a lot of social housing, and they have obviously had to take the housing down and remove the people. And the council were left with the unenviable task of deciding whether to build on green spaces to keep these people within the borough where they live and their friends and family are and their children go to school, etc., or to push them out of the borough and retain these precious green spaces in areas that are very nature depleted as it is. So there are these really tough decisions that we have to make. And, you know, we're living in times that are very difficult for people. We're going through a cost of living crisis. And I recognize that it's really hard. I would probably argue that we are a part of this planet, and we share it with other species, and we have a responsibility to those other species to live alongside them and not destroy their habitat. But even if you don't agree with that, I think it's important for people to have nature and wildness around us. There are countless studies of what it does for our mental health. It's important for us and our children to be able to breathe clean air, and air pollution is a huge problem in urban environments. And if you take away greenery, you take away wildlife, then that is only going to get worse. We know what we're doing to the planet through climate change at the moment, and we know that that's only going to get worse, and we've been experiencing more and more extreme weather events in this country. And again, one of the ways to mitigate that is through greenery. So, there is an argument for our mental health and for our well-being, also for the future of the planet, which we are a part of and we live in. And I think quite often when we're talking about climate change and the climate crisis, we don't talk about biodiversity. And I guess because it all feels so big and hard to grapple with, it's just kind of another aspect. And yes, lots of things are going extinct, and isn't that sad? But actually, the two are intertwined, and you can't really address one without addressing the other. So yeah, there are these conflicts, and Camden Council is going to have to make that decision. And I don't blame them if they build over that green space, if they have no other choice. And there's never going to be a perfect solution. Things are messy and gnarly and imperfect, but that also means that we have some control over them. And I think we should see that as a little bit freeing as well. So, for example, we shouldn't beat ourselves up too much if we feel like we do something that isn't perhaps in the planet's benefit. So maybe we take a flight somewhere, or we forget our reusable water bottle. It's about doing what we can. And, any kind of action is positive and necessary. And so we shouldn't get paralyzed by trying to do things perfectly. We should try to do as much as we can, as soon as we can.
Really well said. And I'll just add that the examples in your book of the people who are already doing things kind of remind me that even when we are doing individual actions, it's really not on us as individuals, that we are still joining a larger effort, that we don't, it's not, no one's calling on us to save the world individually. It is a joint effort. And there are people who already are deeply engaged in this, and we get to participate in that in a number of different meaningful ways.
I completely agree with you. I think, we can all make a difference, but we all need to make that difference. And this is very much about collective action. And, we shouldn't put everything on ourselves. We should do what we can. But that's why it's also really important to use your voice, I think, and use your voice for nature. So be aware of what's happening, and where you can, champion nature, speak up for nature, speak up for urban wildlife, tell people it's there, and use your voice to amplify that cause wherever you can.
Thank you, Florence. That was wonderful. I really appreciate your time. I appreciate your book, which I think is helping me become a more attentive person to the world around me. And as we're planning our gardens for the spring, I think this is really timely as well to help us plan for a bit of wildness in those gardens. Thank you.
Thank you so much for having me.
Wild City is available at your favourite bookshop and is also a part of the Listening Books collection. We'd love to hear how you're encouraging wildlife this year. Find us on Twitter and Instagram at Listening Books, and our Facebook link is in the show notes. The Listening Books podcast is produced by Listening Books, a UK charity that provides an audiobook lending service for over 115,000 members who find that an illness, disability, learning difficulty, or mental health condition affects their ability to read the printed word or hold a book. It's simple to join. For more information, head to our website www.listening-books.org.uk.